Okay, we're back. We're back here talking about the war now. Um, Hopefully, this thing is uploading in the background, part one of this lecture, and it's not going to screw up and get erased. But I want to get this done with. Um, I think I made this, though it's not. It's obviously low-hanging fruit. He's an appeaser. The things that Neville Chamberlain did energized and legitimized Hitler and helped him advance in the ways that he advanced. Um, okay, so we watched that in class. Okay, the fascists are not good people. They're bootlickers. They're liars. They're racists. They're anti-Semites. They're misogynists. I mean, you choose your poison. And this isn't just like low key. Like it's kind of the whole point of the ideology. It's like don't believe in this. But again, people did. And why? Because Weimar Germany sucks. It's the like it Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe in the 90s are the economic test cases for what hyperinflation looks like, right? When you have to put an expiration date on your money because hyperinflation is so out of control. So it's not good, right? It's really, really not good. And the global depression and the suspension of the Dawes Plan really puts the Weimar Germany in a tailspin. There's a huge element of the population that wants communism, socialism. There's another element that wants fascism. The fascists win. And the idea is that he's going to, restore German greatness, revenge for the mistreatment of the Versailles Treaty, all that kind of stuff. One of the things fascists have to expand, and for Germany, this is the policy of Lebensraum, or living. I always say living spaces. You know that ad that's on the living spaces. That's Lebensraum. So Germany's gonna, or we watched that Elbow Room video about Manifest Destiny. Elbow Room. They just need some elbow room. So tough luck, everyone else in Europe. Um, they do a lot of stuff that they're not supposed to do, and no one says anything. New naval construction, not allowed to do that. They send troops into the Rhineland, not allowed to do that. Again, if you're supposed to be like preventing the spread of communism, the Rhineland's on the wrong side. Like the Soviets are over there, like not over here. The French are over here. Um, they annex Austria, or the Anschluss. This is again the sound of music, what's happening in the background. They speak German, we speak German. We're, making our country great. We'll make you great too. Obviously, the Van Trapp family isn't feeling it, as a lot of other Austrians were not. Neville Chamberlain, Edouard Daladier gets out of it. We always remember Neville Chamberlain as the big appeaser, but somehow Edouard Daladier gets out of it. We remember the Maginot Line, I suppose, as a famous French blunder, which I don't talk about in this lecture. But if we want to talk about it and make fun of French military strategy, we can. He appeases, right, in Munich 1938, as Chris Matthews in that clip famously says, right, he gives him, it's not talking to Hitler, it's giving him half of Czechoslovakia. That's the Sudetenland. Germany invades. Still, it's all good. Yeah, fine. It's all good. Troops in the Rhineland, the Anschluss, Sudetenland, building up your navy. What could go wrong? Churchill is right on this. Churchill opposed all of this stuff. It's one of the reasons why Churchill rises to power after Neville Chamberlain's kind of fall, is because he was right. Like he knew what was happening and he opposed it. Usually being against fascism is a good call, right? It just like historically speaking, it seems as though that's generally the right side to be on. So Churchill knew that. Now you done it. He invades Poland in 1939, and then now it's on, right? Czechoslovakia, fine. Austria, fine. Rhineland, fine. This is not good. They tear through Poland very, very quickly. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, moving quickly. Striking, moving on, striking, moving on. Poland's not necessarily prepared either for it. Spring 1940. Invade Denmark and Norway. It seems like an odd choice, but it gives them better access to the Atlantic. If you look at a map of Europe, you'll see Germany doesn't have that much Atlantic coast access. So this gives them that. There's also people in Denmark and Norway that are sympathetic to the whole, racial purity thing. Netherlands, Belgium, into France. Again, this is the folly of the Maginot Line is that France put all their chips in on one little area, and they were heavily militarized with the thinking that the Ardennes forest is like there's like big trees and like rocks, and there's no way an army is going to go through those. Like the sticks are going to get in your face. Like I don't know what they were thinking, but that Germany just goes right around the Maginot Line through the Ardennes forest, through Netherlands and Belgium, and then they're in France. France surrenders pretty quickly. They establish the Vichy government, which is the fascist government in the south. Again, there's people in France that are anti-Semitic. There's people in France that really hate communists. So this whole ideology is not just a German thing, right? There's people across Europe who hold deeply anti-communist views, first and foremost, who think that, liberalism or the government intervention in a kind of like creating social welfare is bad. There's all kinds of stuff like that. There's also anti-Semitism. So there's people who are sympathetic to this. Battle of Britain begins August to October. This is nightly bombings of urban centers. This is where we get the original "Keep calm and carry on." This is a propaganda poster from World War II, posted throughout London and other cities. The most kind of British message imaginable, just like relax, don't worry about it. Interesting because we're at this kind of moment of a sea change in technology. Radar allows the British to know when rockets are on their way, but also like just they turn out all the lights. So for like bombing raids, they just turn all the lights off at night so that, this is still like we're dropping bombs from a plane where there's like someone looking down out of the bottom and like looking at a map and going like, okay, now. So like it's this really weird moment, right, where we have these different technologies. Just like the code breakers, right, the Navajo for the United States, right, using this ancient form of like, right, basically reading code. And applying it to their encrypted messages. June 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and this is where we get, right, Stalin gets the last laugh here. Did you not study anything about Napoleon Bonaparte? Like it doesn't 20 million Russians die, but the Soviet Union is perfectly, if you live or you live west of Moscow, you're going to get sacrificed in whatever kind of conflict you get with Europe. So that's what happens, right, in World War II. In the Pacific, right, again, Pearl Harbor, we know about it. Again, the Japanese are liberating all of these places from the French and other imperial powers, quote unquote. They need resources. The U.S. responds by banning exports of oil to Japan. Hideki Tojo comes to power, I think, in November. And then in December, we get we get Pearl Harbor, which is the beginning of the United States actually involvement in World War II. 2 hours, 200 aircraft, 2,400 people killed. That's a lot of people. And like all things being equal, that's a lot of people, but it's also like in the last 11 months of COVID, it's like a Tuesday. So to give you the scale of people dying, like, right, a lot of people have been dying even recently, right? It's not Pearl Harbor, but these numbers, right? These numbers are kind of like almost, it's unfathomable to think of that many people dying in one day, but it happens. It's kind of incredible. Um, Congress declares war the next day, and that's it. You can't be isolationist anymore. And that's when we get war. I might actually get through this in 2 lectures. That would be something. War on the home front, the good and the bad. We got Rosie the Riveter on the right, the famous image, War Production Coordinating Committee image. Again, these are all New Deal committees, all the artists now kicking into gear, producing wartime propaganda. And then on the left, a very interesting image that has to deal with that deals with it's the front page of the LA Times. Downtown riots flare in LA Zoot Suit War. You read about the Zoot Suit riots. I'll talk more about them. But I want to highlight here something really interesting about the front page of this newspaper, right? The Zoot Suiters, you have here this, it's torn, but it's a young man whose clothes have been ripped off him, his Zoot Suit. And you just look at this is where like looking at a primary source is really important and interesting, because if you're a American, you pick up the newspaper, right, and you look at this page, you see, okay, there's a Zoot Suit war, right? So like a war, this is either Mexican American kids, men and women, that American servicemen are going to war with. A plot of Italians in Greece. So we're talking about Italy here. Churchill, right, an ally abroad. Nazi moves indicate big red drive due. So again, news an article about the Nazis. Here's the Zoot Suit, servicemen beat up 50, and then right the racial epithet here. But Jap center at Potsdam resembles a boom town because there's so many people Japanese Americans being sent to these camps. The juxtaposition is incredible, right? Enemy in Italy, ally in England, enemy in Germany, enemy in Germany, enemy in Los Angeles, Zoot Suiters, enemy in camps, Japanese Americans, right? So like when you look at the various who's on what side and who's on the other side, it really points to a kind of fractured landscape in the United States, where you have, these are Americans. They're Japanese Americans. These are Mexican Americans. But the juxtaposition, right, is kind of very fascinating. Okay. So there's that. We'll talk more about the Zoot Suit riots in a second. Our arsenal of democracy is like all of American manufacturing, but I'm a ride for Detroit because like Detroit was kind of like the real arsenal of democracy. They made all those cars, and then they stopped making cars, and they started making bombers and tanks and military transport vehicles. It's incredible, right? I guess now GM has announced they're going to stop making gas-powered cars in the next 10 years or whatever. But you can go from making a Studebaker to making a B-52 bomber in the matter of like a dozen months, but you can't make a car that gets better than 35 miles a gallon given a decade. It really shows you how the manufacturing can change when it is forced to change, but when it's not forced to change, it sometimes doesn't. They made tanks, they made, whatever, Ford vehicles, and then they were making tanks. Kind of incredible. Anyway, arsenal of democracy. They made a lot of stuff. It's the reason that the Allies won the war, whether it's Detroit or all manufacturing in general. That is largely due to the War Production Board. This precedent has been set during World War I. Remember, to win the war in World War I, all of these various things happen where like the railroads get effectively nationalized, and the government can tell industries what to produce and what industries need to not produce anything. And all of this is to win the war effort. Again, the free market isn't going to win you a war. Because if people want teddy bears, they're going to make teddy bears, and you're not going to beat Hitler with teddy bears. If you need to have a B-52, there's no one demanding B-52 bombers except like the American military and like democracy. So you got to take over. They do take over, and to great effect. People are rationing food. I mean, my father is ancient. And he remembers, right? They had a victory garden. They had to recycle everything. I mean, can you imagine, right? Can you imagine? Again, especially considering our current, circumstances. 500,000 Americans have died from COVID-19, and people can't be bothered to put a tiny piece of fabric on their face. Here's Americans that you couldn't drive around for pleasure. You couldn't wear baggy clothes. This is part of the Zoot Suit riots. It's like baggy clothes were considered un-American. You get beat down if you're wearing baggy clothes in the streets. They're not making cars anymore. People aren't eating meat anymore. They're like they're tearing up their lawns and building victory gardens. People aren't wearing nylons. I mean, you name it. The amount of sacrifices that Americans were very willing to make because they felt a sense of like civic duty, patriotism, and kinship with their fellow Americans is a large part of why, right, this happened, right? Why the war was successful. Certainly on the home front, a lot of problems, Zoot Suit riots, Japanese internment. I'll go over it, but at the same time, the civic responsibility is something, right? Is really something. And again, especially given our kind of current historical moment where freedom is defined by like doing whatever the heck you want, as opposed to, right, making a sacrifice to actually preserve freedom, right? That like in the short term, you might have to sacrifice the most nominal of things, right? We're not asking much here in order to preserve freedom. Obviously people in the 30s and 40s understood it, and were better off for it. 16 million Americans serve the armed forces in some capacity, either as soldiers or as any other number of people working in defense. And that's a lot of people. Women, again, enter the workforce in greater numbers. Servicemen, the GI Bill, it incentivizes joining the military. This is, educational. I mean, you go to any college you want. The original GI Bill, you get into Harvard, they pay for it. You go. Ivy Leagues in particular were actually very against the GI Bill. They really resisted participating in this because they Ivy Leagues in the 40s. It was a bunch of nerds singing songs together. It was not they didn't want a bunch of grizzled veterans coming in and raining on their waspy kind of parade. Turns out if you can survive D-Day, you're gonna do your homework in your Latin class or whatever. The veteran students were very, very good students. And the Ivy Leagues eventually come around to it. All colleges come around to it. Home loans, mortgages, all of this stuff. Of course, GI Bill doesn't necessarily discriminate on matters of race, but there's already existing ways in which Black Americans are excluded from these programs. FHA, home loans they can't get, the schools are segregated, redlining. So again, Black veterans are excluded from these benefits. I emphasize these points here, right, of Black Americans are excluded from this, Black Americans are excluded from that, because it's really important to understand why the 1960s and 70s is a success in some ways, because you have these Black veterans returning and they're going to be active in demanding civil rights. But it also highlights how civil rights is ultimately going to be a failure, because the groundwork is being laid already in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, Ossian Suite, all the way to the GI Bill, of segregated communities being created in which you can pass the Voting Rights Act. You can make Jim Crow laws illegal. But once you've established a pattern of residential segregation in which one neighborhood is good and no black people are allowed to live there, and another neighborhood is very, very bad and only black people can live there, they can't get out. Like, what does voting rights do? Right? Yes, it's important to vote, but like, what does Jim Crow segregation do when you have geographic segregation? So again, all of this stuff is important because it's going to help us understand the really the failures of what we'll learn in the next period with civil rights. It's a long time in the making. To that end, the double V for victory, victory against fascism abroad, and victory against racism at home. Obviously, not a good look if you're attacking Germany, and one of the reasons they're bad is they have this whole like white supremacy thing, and you're doing it too. Not a good look, right? So a lot of Americans, black Americans in particular, are demanding this double V for victory. Black Americans join the armed services, they fight abroad, and when they come home, they demand civil rights. They threaten a march on Washington. Executive Order 8802, which integrates the defense industries, preempts that. Roosevelt, being a smart politician, knows that a massive rally demanding like racial equality is not going to be a good look while you're fighting Nazis. So he does that. And then again, when veterans return home, remember, if you're a black vet and you're on leave in Europe and you're in Paris, you can go anywhere you want. Right? Yeah, like it's not a utopia. There's still racism. It's largely directed towards like Algerians and stuff, like France's imperial, or like any number of Africans. But it's not like the United States. You have a freedom that a lot of black veterans have never felt before, especially if they're from the South. Those people come back after the war and they say, look, we're not only trained in war, and we've seen death and destruction, and we've fought against all of this stuff, but we've tasted freedom and we want it. So this is kind of 1945, at the end of the war, we get kind of the beginnings of civil rights. Meanwhile, not so good stuff by other service men. The Zoot Suit riots, largely exclusively white servicemen in Long Beach, in LA. On leave, they attack young Zoot Suiters, which you see here. The Zoot Suit was it still is, I suppose you can still get Zoot Suits, kind of very baggy suit, like long, big coat, baggy pants, pegged at the bottom, very colorful, and they were a symbol of youth culture, primarily Mexican American in the Southwest, and then black in Chicago, New York. So like Malcolm X, before he converts to Islam, was a Zoot Suiter, right? A lot of young people, and I say people of color, not just men of color, because like the Zoot Suiters also, like the female Zoot Suiters of Pachucas, was like also a style that was seen as un-American, weirdly, because the baggy clothes, right? Because it's not patriotic. You should be conserving, right, your clothing, and an outfit that has so much an excess of clothing is seen as, right, a waste. Again, this is a fear of the enemy within. Remember, a lot of these servicemen are from the South, so they're used to, if you're not white, you don't look at a white person in the eye. You step off of the sidewalk into the street, you like look down. You certainly aren't in integrated movie theaters. Southern California is integrated, right? If it's segregated at all, it's anti-black, right? But like there's a range of movement for Mexican Americans that these white Southerners are not used to seeing, right? They attack them. It goes on for several days. It's a bad look. It's obviously motivated by race. And this is, again, one of the ironies of the United States fighting against fascism abroad, and racial, the Aryan Germans, right, implementing their strategy of racial superiority, and yet, right? So again, the Double V for Victory campaign points this irony out, and yet we still have it here. Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans use an right photo of, I think this is actually Santa Monica in the 1930s, 1938. Before internment, the Japanese American community is very unique, right? Because of the Gentlemen's Agreement in 1907, because of the Johnson-Reed Anti-Immigration Act in 1924, you have a very unique community of people in that you have the Issei, or first generation immigrant community, and then you have Nisei, which is second generation. And then there's like Sunsei, Yunsei, there's like third and fourth, there's other generations. But in the 1940s, we're talking two generations. People who were born in Japan and came here, and then people who were born here. If you're born here, from the Wong Kim Ark decision in the 1890s, you're a citizen. So these are not just like Japanese people. These are American citizens. They're largely upper middle class. A lot of them are business owners, publishing. Los Angeles in particular is a kind of hub of Japanese, what we would maybe call entrepreneurship. They're rather conservative. They're not like Popular Front leftists, right? They're capitalists, right? This is like immigrant success story type stuff. So that is all the more painful potentially, right? That they're suddenly targeted for this kind of like, anti-Japanese violence. This is a similar thing happens with Muslim Americans or Arab Americans in particular after 9/11. People who were upwardly mobile, right, business owners, fairly conservative in their voting, and suddenly they're being targeted, right, in a way that they're just not used to, because they're almost accepted as white, right? They're not Chinese. Chinese in California face far more discrimination. They're not Filipinos. Filipinos face far more discrimination, and they would have had kind of colorism of their own, right, looking down on, say, Chinese or Filipinos. Well, Executive Order 9906 is a kind of an equalizer of sorts, and suddenly the Japanese Americans are in the crosshairs of the American government. People who are fanboys of Roosevelt usually leave 9906 out of their telling of the story here. Not a good look for Roosevelt. 100 to 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, 62%. These are American citizens relocated. This is the interesting thing, right? Hawaii is full of Japanese, right? Full of 40% of the population. No one from Hawaii is sent to internment camps. Couple reasons. One, the obvious one, you can't send 40% of your population to, Manzanar and expect to have an economy that functions. Two is exposure. There's actually so many Japanese Americans in Hawaii, or Japanese and Japanese Americans in Hawaii, that you have far more tolerance for Japanese and Japanese Americans. West Coast is different. The Japanese on the West Coast have always been discriminated against primarily in farming, first and foremost. White farmers who were felt threatened by, this is why Asians couldn't own land and all of these other rules that are put in place in California and other Western states to eliminate competition with white farmers. And if you're Japanese in New York or Chicago, you don't go to a camp, right? So it raises the question of why. When you look at a map here, right, this is the exclusion area is just the West Coast. This is politics. This is political, right? No Japanese in Hawaii are sent to camps. No Japanese in Chicago or New York are sent to camps because the political pressure isn't there. There's political pressure in the West, in Oregon, Washington, California, to get rid of this group of people who are seen as an economic threat, right? So it really is not about security. If it was about security, Hawaii would be, priority number one. If it was about race exclusively, Japanese Americans in Chicago or New York would have been sent to camps as well. So why, right? Why this particular region? It's because of politics and political pressures, and that's why we get what we get. Here is a picture of Manzanar. If you go up to Mammoth, it is a must stop. There's a place for good, like a German, this is like weirdly World War II-y, and it's like the ethnicities. There's a German place for good sandwiches that you need to stop at. And then there's Manzanar. Those are the two reasons to stop, or like to use the bathroom on the way to Manzanar. Manzanar's very, very good exhibit. Very, very good exhibit. Quite impressive. And this is Manzanar. After internment, very few internees remain west of the Rockies. Little Tokyo is actually repopulated by Black Americans. After the war, they're forced out. Rancho Palos Verdes is taken over by white farmers and developers. They're not forced out. So you see a bit of the gradations of race and power in the post-war litigation to get Japanese property back, that Japanese Americans are higher on the racial hierarchy than Black Americans because they get Little Tokyo and their businesses and their apartments kind of back through the courts, obviously, but Palos Verdes, not so much. Palos Verdes, because it was like in the middle of nowhere, was largely Japanese farmland and fishing before World War II. Finally, there was redress in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan signs the Civil Liberties Act, 1988, which gives $22,000 to each surviving internee, 82,000 plus checks total. Again, imagine, right? Again, the political climate is very different from our own. People actually redressing Ronald Reagan? Making good on this, American injustice. Different times. Okay, God rest him. Christopher Plummer died this year, just very recently, just a month ago, as of me talking now in March of 2021. Captain Von Trapp doesn't like Nazis. He likes Austria, Edelweiss, and all that. Nazis lose. And the major thing that is exposed, American intelligence knew about what was happening, right, to some degree already. And Germans knew what was happening. You don't have all of the people in your neighborhood, Jews in your neighborhood, disappear without asking questions. They were walled up in ghettos in Warsaw, in other places. So this is not a surprise. People have been killed before, en masse, right, since the beginning of time kind of thing. What is unique about the Holocaust is, yes, the numbers, 6 million Jews, 4.5 million Soviets, prisoners of war, you name it, disabled communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone gay is targeted. So the scale of the killing is certainly kind of, unfathomable. But what's important to remember about the Holocaust is it's the combination of very specific historical factors. The first is scientific racism. We studied scientific racism, Herbert Spencer, social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, eugenics, all that stuff. By the 1930s in England and the United States, which was the home of all this thinking, right? It's all English. There's some French in there, but it's mostly English and American. By the 20s and the 30s, it's kind of like, we don't really think that anymore. We still might think of racial superiority, but not in a genetic or biological way. The Nazis say, oh, no, right? Oh, this new science is too, they wouldn't have used the term politically correct, but if they had it, they certainly would have used it, right? The real science is this older science. Scientists nowadays don't want to say, right, what is really true. This is the real stuff. They use scientific racism, and then they use technology, right? The kind of scientific rationality of genocide. It's not just indiscriminate sexual violence, killing, whatever, burning villages. It is a scientific, rational, bureaucratized approach to genocide, which is totally new. And then, of course, fascism. Fascism is by definition, an ideology that needs to find an enemy within, needs to find some other to vilify and to attack, and is obsessed with purity, is obsessed with returning to some kind of great state that existed in the past, and that is somehow we've fallen from grace as a society. And all of these factors come together to create what the Nazis termed as the final solution to the problems, right, facing German society, facing European society. And that's why the Holocaust is so, really unfathomable to imagine. It's very hard to imagine the scale of the killing. And part of the reason why it happened is precisely that bureaucratization. That it wasn't, there was a lot of people involved who were just filling out forms, right? Sending these people on this train, going here, going there, put a stamp on it, put a date on it, a time, send it over there, goes to that office, it goes over here, someone else. It's bureaucracy, right? So that, again, it's a kind of systemic form of genocide in which it's not any one single person is responsible for it. They have, so concentration camps come first and extermination camps come second. Concentration camps are, there can be work camps where people weren't killed, but the purpose of the extermination camps like Birkenau, Auschwitz, and others is just for killing, right? For forced labor and killing. You have here the numbers. You have also the headline, 1939. It's in your book too. The St. Louis, which is, again, the United States is also harbors anti-Semitic beliefs and anti-immigrant beliefs. Remember, after Johnson Reed, 1924, very anti-immigrant in the law, very anti-immigrant policy. The boat is sent back to Europe, and we know that people aboard the St. Louis did end up in extermination camps. The image in the background is Nazis, soldiers being forced to look at the images of, I think it's Auschwitz. Okay. It wasn't just Jewish Germans or Jewish Poles. It's also Romani, right? So you have on the left, Romani, or the people, gypsy is not like, because it's been used as a racial epithet for long enough where it's like not, it's like the N word. So Romani is the actual ethnic population. They exist throughout Europe. They're targeted also, sent to camps. I think that is in the last, Romani, 130 to 500,000 sent to camps. And then also here from Newsvolk, or the People's News, it says 600,000 German marks. What this person, it's about hereditary illness. So people who have hereditary illnesses, disabilities, also either targeted for being not just only sent to camps, but euthanized, right, in their youth, because it's too much money to sustain them. So, right, this is what you get. This is the logical conclusion of racial supremacy, right? So the idea of thinking one race is better than another, thinking you are better than someone else because of your race, this is where you get with that, right? This is where you end up. And it's, right, it's a road that is paved brick by brick. You don't get to Auschwitz like that, right? You know, it's small comments, it's anti-Semitic imagery and cartoons, it's Kristallnacht, it's people being denied jobs, it's people being sent to prison or camps disproportionately to their population. This is where you get, right? So that's why it's like not good. Okay, quickly here, I need to get to the A-bomb, I suppose. I'll go through quickly. I feel like the next chapter is going to talk about a divided Germany, so I'll just go through quickly. Germany is divided up, 4 different zones. Denazification happens. They get rid of, all remnants of the Nazi Party. They try, convict, and execute members of the Nazi Party. Officials are removed from office. Textbooks are altered. You can't have swastikas in Germany. The image is outlawed. Even the word Volk is considered verboten until, use another German word, is considered prohibited or considered taboo until very recently. There's a new German far-right extremist party that does use the word Volk, but it's very controversial. I bring all this stuff up, right, because this didn't happen after the Civil War. It didn't happen after civil rights. That Germany was forced to confront with racial supremacy in a way that changed its society for the better. It's better to not have swastikas. It's better to not have, people believing in anti-Semitism or what have you. It's just better to have that. And the United States and its allies, I mean, in the beginning of the end of the war, really try and go through and try to do this. They let their foot off the gas eventually because, again, communism is seen as the big threat, right? So they let their foot off the gas with the denazification, as though they'd learned nothing. Atomic bomb production, it happens. The Manhattan Project. Truman really is so FDR kicks the bucket, right? He's run for president like 1,000,000 times and won. FDR takes over. FDR's last term, they replace William Wallace, which is the Scotsman and which is the vice president, Henry Wallace. They replace him because he's too radical. He's Popular Front leftist. They replace him with Truman. Roosevelt does in fact die. Truman takes over, has no idea a bomb is being worked on. Roosevelt sees World War II through to its completion. They drop in 1945. First atomic weapon. The second one is shortly thereafter. 230,000 people killed instantly. Others, many thousands more because of radiation. This isn't even, more people die in the firebombing of Tokyo, right? So I'm not saying, not trying to in any way, shape, or form justify Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but in terms of like deadly aerial campaigns against the Japanese mainland, the firebombing of Tokyo is up there with the atomic bomb. Atomic bomb obviously is a brand new technology and alters the course of the world, so it's important. Japanese surrender on the condition that the Emperor Hirohito would remain in power. They don't. Hideki Tojo is not so fortunate. He is executed, and that's it. That ends. We have VE Day is victory in Europe, right? Hitler and his inner circle kill themselves as the Russians are approaching. And then VJ Day, victory against Japan, victory in the Pacific, happens later. And then World War II is over. We're going to hear more about nuclear power and bombs in the post-war world, but it will be the Soviets that are the threat, not anyone else. Well, China in 1949. But more on that next time. That's all for now.